It had been raining that evening, the kind of steady, reluctant drizzle Oxford knows too well. The corridors of St. Fridarswyde's College had that faint scent of damp wool and chalk dust, mingled with the ghost of long-extinguished pipe smoke. I remember thinking as I paused by the porter's desk that the air in certain places never quite dries out. It holds memory, like stone holds moisture. I was not meant to be there, or rather, I had told myself I wasn't. The call from the dean had sounded routine enough, a small matter, a faculty concern, a favour for the police. Yet by the time I stood beneath that flickering lamp, watching the pale rectangle of corridor recede into silence, I knew it was something else. Some corridors persuade you of their own quiet importance. At the far end, a door stood ajar. Beyond it, the echo of voices slow, uncertain, like a rehearsal of civility after an interruption. I caught fragments of timetable, committee, and resignation. Then the sudden hush that follows awareness of a listener. The dean, tall and delicately dishevelled, emerged first. Behind him, Dr. Elspeth Rayner, fellow in classics, whose reputation for intellect was matched only by her capacity for disdain. She greeted me without warmth, but with that curious flicker of interest reserved for men who might one day inconvenience her. The dean murmured something about confidentiality and left her to explain. There had been an incident, she said, a locked corridor, a single key gone missing, and a student, Jonathan Keene, who had vanished sometime between evening prayers and the first roll call of dawn. No struggle, no note, no trace of departure. Just absence, neatly wrapped in routine. The police had filed it as voluntary disappearance, but the college couldn't bear the scandal of ambiguity. I listened, hands in pockets, trying to map the rhythm of her sentences. Each pause seemed too carefully measured. I asked whether Keene had any enemies. She smiled faintly at Oxford. That was an impossible question. Everyone has enemies. It was merely a matter of how politely they greeted you over tea. We walked down the corridor together. Her heels made a sound like punctuation-controlled, declarative. She gestured toward a notice board crowded with term schedules, choir lists, and an untidy crossword pinned beside a missing person flyer. Someone had filled half of it in with black ink, then crossed out 2 words in frustration. I noted that. Most people don't cross out their own answers. They simply write over them, stubbornly, believing themselves correct. Whoever had done this had doubted their own certainty. The corridor led to Keene's room. I recall its chill, the sort peculiar to student quarters left untended, books everywhere, some stacked, others splayed open like casualties. On the desk, a Latin text and an unfinished letter stopped mid-sentence. I have begun to understand that what? I wondered. The ink had dried unevenly, the way it does when someone hesitates longer than they meant to. Outside, the rain intensified, ticking against the window pane like a slow metronome. Elspeth asked if I believed in coincidence. I said I didn't, though I rarely trusted intention either. She told me Keene had been translating fragments of Ovid and that he'd lately become preoccupied with a legend concerning disappearance and transformation. I remarked that Oxford was full of such legends, only the names changed. Later, as I walked back along the corridor, I noticed the faintest draft from beneath a locked door, the one opposite Keene's room. I bent slightly, feeling foolish, and caught a trace of something sweet and metallic in the air. Not decay, exactly something earlier than that. The porter, when asked, swore the room had been empty for months, awaiting renovation. He handed me a heavy ring of keys, none of which, he added with visible relief, would fit that lock. It was near midnight when I left. The quadrangle lay slick with rain, lamps reflected in shallow puddles like small, unsteady moons. I told myself there was nothing yet to suspect, that I'd merely been called to listen. Still, I paused at the gate, glancing back at that corridor, glowing dimly through the glass, as though it were a throat about to speak. I lit a cigarette, though I'd promised to stop, and thought of the half-crossed crossword, the hesitation in ink. Sometimes I've found the first clue in any case is not what's missing, but what someone couldn't quite bring themselves to complete. The morning began with the faint, almost ecclesiastical quiet that settles over Oxford when rain decides to take the day off. The city looked scrubbed clean, though the air still carried that post-storm heaviness like an apology from the sky. I walked toward St. Fridayswide's with the sluggish purpose of a man who has slept little and thought too much. They told me Dr. Rayner was to give a lecture at 11, Classical Metamorphosis and Moral Consequence, the notice board had promised. But the hall was nearly empty when I arrived. A few undergraduates sat slouched like spectators at an abandoned play. At the lectern stood the deputy warden, clearing his throat into the silence. Dr. Rayner, he explained with brittle politeness, had been delayed. He would be reading her prepared notes. He began, though her words didn't belong to him. I could feel that instantly. The sentences lacked her particular rhythm, that blend of precision and disdain I'd come to recognize. He stumbled once on a Greek phrase and smiled too readily as if performing competence. I found myself wondering why she hadn't simply postponed. Midway through, a thin student in a brown coat slipped in at the back. I recognized him from the missing boy's photograph Keen's roommate, if I recall correctly. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands twisting the strap of his satchel as if trying to strangle a thought. When the reading ended and polite applause fluttered, he was the first to leave. I followed. Outside, the courtyard glimmered faintly in the weak sunlight. I caught up with him near the cloisters, asked if he'd known Keen well. He said they'd shared notes, nothing more. But his voice carried that tremor of someone remembering what he'd rehearsed to say. I asked about the crossword in the corridor. He looked puzzled, then cautious. Keen liked puzzles, he murmured. Said they were the only thing in life that could be solved without hurting anyone. Then he walked away before I could ask whether that was a memory or a confession. I lingered by the ancient wall, tracing my finger over the pale green moss that formed in the mortar's cracks. Somewhere above, the college bell rang at noon. A sparrow landed on the sundial, shivering. Oxford continued its endless performance of calm intellect, while beneath the marble the soil hummed with old secrecy. Later I found myself in the staff common room. Two fellows were discussing funding allocations, though the conversation had that unmistakable undertone of gossip in academic disguise. One of them, a thin man with spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose, mentioned that Rayner had been unusually anxious. Missing a lecture was not in her nature. The other replied that anxiety was unbecoming in a woman of her intellect. I stirred my coffee and said nothing. Some silences are more instructive than questions. On a nearby notice board hung another of those crosswords fresh today, the clues written in neat blue ink. The fifth across read, "Transformation denied," 5 letters. The answer, I thought absently, might be stone. Back in my room that evening, I tried reading through Rayner's published papers. Elegant, severe, almost accusatory in tone. Every argument built like a staircase one ascends, but never quite reaches a landing. In her last essay, a marginal note caught my eye. Only those who believe themselves unchanged are capable of vanishing. I wondered whether Keen had read it too. I poured a measure of whiskey and watched the amber light refract through the glass. Somewhere a clock struck 6, its chime swallowed by the city's quiet. I thought again of the unattended lecture, the empty hall, the proxy voice, the absence made public. Oxford has always been expert at turning absence into ceremony. As night pressed in, I opened the crossword I'd torn from the board. The clue about transformation stared back at me. I filled in stone, then hesitated, feeling the echo of Keen's uncertainty. Perhaps the answer wasn't stone at all. Perhaps it was true. And perhaps that too was something best left unfinished. It was the sort of afternoon Oxford does best in sunlight, filtering through damp air, the faint smell of decay sweetened by wet leaves. The river had risen from recent rains, and its surface trembled with small eddies, restless like thought itself. I walked there without real intent, as I often do when a case refuses to speak plainly. Movement, I've found, can sometimes persuade the mind to loosen its knots. A rower passed, his oars slicing the water in perfect rhythm, though his eyes betrayed exhaustion. A cox shouted something shrill, echoing beneath the bridge, and for a moment the symmetry of sound and motion almost distracted me from the reason I had come. They had found Keen's bicycle propped against a willow near the boathouse. It had been standing there 3 days before anyone noticed Oxford's particular genius for selective blindness. Students had walked past it, porters had smoked near it, yet none had thought to ask why it waited without an owner. When they finally did, it was already too late for surprise. The constable on duty pointed out the details dutifully: the clean chain, the dry saddle, the absence of footprints nearby. I nodded, pretending to listen, but my mind drifted toward the small inconsistencies that never announced themselves loudly. The bell on the handlebar had been polished recently. A small act of care, oddly out of place in the messy life of a student. Whoever left it there had wanted it to be seen, not lost. A breeze unsettled the surface of the river. I caught a faint glint below a flash of metal that vanished almost at once. The constable dismissed it as sunlight. I told him perhaps he was right, though I made a note to return after dusk. Walking upriver, I found myself by the lock, where an elderly keeper sat outside his hut, smoking in that steady, contemplative way men smoke when time has ceased to hurry them. He remembered Keen vaguely as a polite boy, often reading while others rowed, the sort who looked at the water as though waiting for it to answer back. He also mentioned Dr. Rayner had visited once, alone, 2 nights before the boy's disappearance. She'd stood by the bank, watching the current, and left without speaking. He remembered this not for its strangeness, but because she'd left behind a small umbrella, black, with her initials engraved in silver. I didn't ask how he knew the initials. Oxford runs on quiet recognitions. The sky darkened by slow degrees. I walked further along the path, toward the meadows where the river splits and forgets its direction. The ground was soft beneath my shoes. A dog barked in the distance, then nothing. I stopped near a bench, carved with the initials of long-gone lovers, sat and watched the water move past with the certainty of something ancient and indifferent. I thought again of the crossword clue transformation, denied, and of Rayner's missing lecture. Patterns were beginning to form, faint but insistent, like a melody heard through walls. The boy's translation work, her fascination with Ovid, the bicycle polished but abandoned all fragments of an argument not yet spoken aloud. When I finally rose to leave, I noticed a scrap of paper caught in the reeds by the bank. I pulled it free, half dissolved by water, but legible enough. It was from a college bulletin, a notice about a seminar on mythic metamorphosis. Someone had underlined a phrase in red ink: "That which resists change invites disappearance." The same ink, I realized, as the corrections on Keen's letter. Back at the college, twilight had folded itself neatly over the quads. Lights glowed behind mullioned windows, warm and domestic. I paused by the chapel, hearing faint organ practice within. A fragment of Bach, deliberate and unresolved. Later, in my room, I laid the damp scrap beside my glass of whiskey. The ink had bled into the fibres, turning words into shadows. I thought of the river, of how it keeps everything that falls into it, though never quite in the same form. Perhaps Oxford, too, was a kind of river endlessly absorbing its losses, changing their shapes until no one could say where truth ended and legend began. Outside, rain began again, tentative, like a thought reconsidered. It was in the library that I first understood how silence can become an accomplice. The old reading room at St. Friedeswide's is shaped like an apology long, vaulted, perpetually dim, and that afternoon the rain had begun again, in its indecisive Oxford fashion. Water tapped against the panes with a rhythm that seemed almost considerate, as though mindful not to disturb the scholars within. I had come to speak with the librarian, a man whose devotion to order bordered on theology. He greeted me with that particular Oxford courtesy that conceals resentment beneath precision. He had, he said, been asked to gather a list of books borrowed by Jonathan Keene. It was short, Ovid, naturally, a volume of Nietzsche's fragments, and, curiously, a thin pamphlet on ethics in translation, its pages uncut. That last detail stayed with me to borrow what one never intended to open. It spoke of either deceit or despair. While he fetched the register, I wandered through the aisles. The air was dense with old bindings and human pretense. On a desk near the window lay a pair of spectacles, modern, fine-rimmed, out of place amid the monastic gloom. When I asked, the librarian said they belonged to Dr. Rayner. She often left them behind, he murmured, though he smiled when he said it. I wondered if he had noticed, as I did, that the lenses were not for reading, but for distance. A woman who wished to see clearly what was far away. As he spoke, I noticed a small stack of papers marked for disposal. One bore the faint impression of a note that had been removed. The indentation, when angled to the light, revealed a few half-formed words: corridor, key, supper. It was the last that mattered. The dining hall had been locked that night for a private dinner, a detail that hadn't appeared in any report. I thanked the librarian and left him to his dust. Outside, the rain had gathered into a soft drizzle, and the bells from Christ Church drifted faintly across the rooftops. I walked without direction, ending up near the cloisters again. The college cat, the inevitable feline of academia, slinked across my path, its coat mottled with rain, its eyes reflecting nothing at all. Later that evening I found myself in Rayner's office. She had agreed to meet, though her tone suggested obligation rather than trust. The room smelled of paper and hyacinths, an incongruous combination. She sat behind her desk, her expression carefully unreadable. I mentioned the pamphlet. She said Keene had borrowed it at her suggestion. Translation, she observed, was the art of absence. One must betray the text to preserve its truth. The words lingered long after she spoke them. When I asked about the dinner that night, she hesitated not long, but long enough. A committee supper, she said finally. Faculty only. Keene had not been present. Her hands rested too neatly on the table. I noticed a thin line of ink across her palm, the kind that comes from leaking fountain pens. It struck me then that her fountain pen had not been among the items on her desk. Absence again. As I left, I caught my reflection in the rain-darkened glass. Behind me, she remained motionless, a figure framed by books and lamplight, like a portrait painted to conceal rather than reveal. Back in my room, I poured a measure of whiskey and unfolded my notes. The page, with the indented words, lay beneath the crossword I'd kept since the first day. Transformation denied. 5 letters. I wrote stone again, then erased it, as though the word itself had grown dishonest. Absence, I thought, was not the opposite of presence. It was its echo sharper, more telling. The library, the bicycle, the missing pen, each absence left its shape behind, a negative image demanding to be filled. Perhaps, in the end, that is all investigation is, the study of absence, pursued by those who mistake silence for truth. The rain had stopped by then. Oxford streets gleamed like ink spilled across parchment. Somewhere a bell struck 9, and for once it sounded less like an ending than a breath held too long. The archive lay beneath the college chapel, hidden behind a narrow door that always seemed slightly embarrassed to exist. The air there was still and faintly metallic, as if time had oxidized. It was a place that asked you to move quietly, not out of reverence, but self-preservation. Dust can feel like accusation when disturbed. I had gone to see the records clerk, a woman named Mrs. Godfrey, whose years in that dim labyrinth had given her a pale translucence, as though light had been steadily drained from her over decades. She looked up when I entered, not startled, but faintly curious, the way a librarian might regard an unexpected footnote. "You're looking for the boy," she said, before I could ask. "They always are." Her voice was soft but unyielding, the sound of someone long accustomed to guarding other people's secrets. She motioned toward a table stacked with bound registers. Each contained the movements of generations, admissions, fines, expulsions, small betrayals preserved in immaculate ink. She had already pulled the file, Jonathan Keene. The pages were unremarkable, modest marks, no disciplinary notes, one reference to an extension granted for illness, yet a slip of paper, unrelated, had been tucked between them, a list of borrowed items signed by Dr. Rayner herself. Not books, but objects, a projector, a set of slides labelled Myth and Identity, and a reel of recorded lectures from the 1950s. I asked why those would be in a student's file. Mrs. Godfrey shrugged. "The archive," she said, "has its own logic. Things drift here." While she spoke, I noticed her hands. The nails were rimmed with grey dust, but the fingertips gleamed faintly, polished by handling too many secrets. She saw me watching and smiled one of those quiet smiles that seemed both confessional and defensive. I remember her saying that sometimes the living make less noise than the dead, and that the archive was full of conversations she'd learned to ignore. She offered to let me hear the reel. I followed her through a corridor where the light bulbs hummed with fatigue. The room we entered smelled of dry parchment and iron. She loaded the tape, and the voice that emerged startled me with its intimacy. A woman's, low, deliberate, every syllable carefully weighed. The lecture was on metamorphosis. The speaker quoted Ovid, but not in the way scholars usually do. Her tone made it sound like confession. I recognized the voice almost immediately. Rayner. The lecture drifted through myth and meaning, transformation as punishment, transformation as mercy. Then she paused, audibly uncertain. "And when transformation fails," she said softly, "absence must take its place." The tape hissed, and then a faint rustling of papers, perhaps, or a breath caught too close to the microphone. I asked Mrs. Godfrey if that was the only recording. She nodded, though her eyes flickered toward a locked drawer beneath the machine. I left her for a while to wander the aisles. The shelves towered above me like verdicts, boxes labelled only with years, thin ribbons holding their contents closed. Somewhere nearby, water dripped, an irregular heartbeat in the silence. I thought of Keene down here, perhaps researching, perhaps hiding. The air felt both protective and suffocating, as though the past were reluctant to let anyone leave. Returning to the table, I found Mrs. Godfrey reading a note I hadn't noticed before, its paper yellowed to near transparency. It bore the same red ink as the underlined phrase I'd found by the river. The handwriting, unmistakably Rayner's, read, "He understood too well the cost of translation." When I asked where she'd found it, she said she hadn't. It had simply appeared one morning in the outgoing correspondence tray, unsigned, unclaimed. Oxford has a way of producing ghosts that use stationery. Outside, the afternoon had sunk into a thin grey fog. I climbed the chapel steps and paused halfway. From beneath the floor came the faint whir of the reel still turning, the voice rising again, through the stone, distant and insistent. Transformation denied. I thought then of the crossword, the bicycle, the missing umbrella. All fragments orbiting a single absence, a philosophy of disappearance enacted in careful stages. The woman in the archive had preserved it all unknowingly, perhaps like a priest who believes she is keeping records when she is, in fact, keeping faith. By the time I stepped out into the cloister, night had already gathered in the corners. The rain began once more, hesitant as remorse. Somewhere behind me, the reel finally ended, leaving only the soft static of memory pretending to be silence. I have never trusted dinners in Oxford. They promise conversation and deliver strategy. By the time the wine is poured, alliances have been arranged with the precision of an ancient ritual. The evening I was invited to dine at St. Frideswide's, I knew it was less a courtesy than a summons. The Dean's message had been brief, attendance expected, dress formal, no guests. The formality of silence disguised the urgency beneath. The hall was candlelit, though not for atmosphere. Electricity had failed in part of the old wing, or so the porter claimed. The effect was uncanny. Faces flickered between shadow and flame, scholars transformed into medieval effigies of themselves. I took my seat midway along the table, opposite Dr. Elspeth Rayner. She inclined her head in that manner of hers that managed to appear both gracious and weary. The meal began without preamble. Soup first, tasteless and tepid, followed by a dish that looked better than it deserved. I listened as the conversation drifted over the usual topography, funding shortages, student apathy, the moral decline of the modern mind. Yet beneath the polite murmur there was a strange undercurrent. People paused too long before speaking, weighing their words as though each syllable carried an implication. It was the Dean who broke the rhythm. He mentioned casually that the police inquiry into Keen's disappearance had officially been closed. Suicide was the suggested conclusion, though no body had been found. I glanced at Rayner. Her spoon trembled almost imperceptibly, enough to ripple the surface of her soup. She set it down carefully, her gaze fixed on the tablecloth, as if memorizing its pattern. After the pudding course, sherry was served. The Dean raised his glass in a toast to the continuity of scholarship. It sounded almost like an apology. The others echoed it dutifully. I drank, though the sweetness felt misplaced. When the meal ended, we moved to the senior common room. The air smelled of tobacco and damp wool. I found myself beside Rayner again. She spoke softly, as if afraid the walls might listen. She said she'd received a letter that morning, unsigned, postmarked locally. The handwriting, she thought, might be Keen's. It contained only one line the river remembers. I asked if she still had it. She said she had burned it. Not out of fear, she added, but fatigue. A strange choice of word, and truer than she intended. I watched her light a cigarette with unsteady hands, the flame reflecting in her eyes like a confession she would not voice. Later, as the others debated Latin curricula and the ethics of co-education, I excused myself. The corridor outside the common room stretched long and dark, lit only by the dying light of the candelabras. I stood there a moment, listening. Somewhere below, in the courtyard, a clock began to strike 10. The echoes seemed to move upward through the stone, vibrating faintly beneath my feet. Something in the rhythm of the evening had bothered me. The Dean's announcement, too conveniently timed Rayner's silence, too deliberate. And then, the letter. The phrase "the river remembers." It was not merely poetic. It was referential. I recalled the line from Ovid she had quoted on the reel in the archive Flumina restituit, que rapuit unda. The river restores what the wave has taken. I found myself walking toward the exit before reason caught up with me. Outside the night was thick and wet, the kind of Oxford rain that muffles footsteps. The path glistened with reflected light from the hall windows, and I could hear the faint hum of the river beyond the meadow. I wondered whether Keane's message, if genuine, was meant as a warning or confession or both. By the time I reached the gate, the bells had stopped, leaving only the quiet persistence of water. I looked back once, seeing the glow of the dining hall through the mist. The scholars inside, preserved like ghosts in amber, would dine again tomorrow, speaking the same words, raising the same glasses. Oxford, after all, has always thrived on repetition. I walked on, the phrase repeating itself in my mind, not as memory, but as instruction. The river remembers. And so, I suppose, must I. There are moments in any investigation when the rhythm falters, when one must pause, not out of exhaustion, but because the silence demands it. That morning, after a night of rain and unanswered thoughts, I found myself sitting in the porter's lodge at St. Frideswide's, a cup of tea cooling between my hands. The porter, old Wilkes, had been there longer than most of the dons combined. He possessed the particular calm of men who have watched too much and spoken too little. We had exchanged the usual formalities, both pretending not to notice the undertone of caution in the other's voice. Then, unprompted, he mentioned that Dr. Rayner had left the college grounds the previous evening by the north gate, unusual since the main gate was unlocked at the time. He'd seen her return an hour later, alone, carrying what looked like a stack of papers under her coat, though the rain had already soaked through. I asked if she had said anything. He smiled faintly. Only that the river was higher than she'd remembered. That phrase again. The river. It had begun to appear like a refrain through every conversation, quiet yet insistent. I finished my tea, thanked him, and walked toward the Fellows' Garden. The morning light had the thin translucence of an old photograph. Dew clung to the benches, and somewhere beyond the yew hedge a blackbird rehearsed its hesitant melody. When I reached Rayner's room, the door stood half open. She was inside, pouring tea into 2 cups, though no one else was present. She looked up, unsurprised to see me, and gestured toward the empty chair. I sat, and she handed me the 2nd cup. The steam rose between us, faintly perfumed, and for a moment neither of us spoke. She asked if I believed in redemption. I said I wasn't sure I'd earned the right to. She smiled one of those brittle smiles meant for endings rather than beginnings. She told me she had been to the river again. Not to mourn, but to remember. Jonathan Keane had been working on a paper for her study on how translation alters not only language but moral intent. He'd argued that to translate is to distort, that meaning must drown so that understanding can surface. It had unsettled her. He'd grown obsessive, she said, searching for the pure form beneath words, as though one could strip language down to its soul. While she spoke, I noticed a faint mark on her wrist like an old ink stain or the edge of a bruise. She followed my gaze, then placed her hand flat on the table. She said quietly that Keane had given her a gift before he vanished, a small notebook bound in blue cloth. It contained fragments of his translations, mostly from Ovid, but the last page was blank except for a single line. The river knows the original text. She reached into a drawer and brought it out. The paper was swollen from damp, the ink blurred but legible. I leafed through it, the scent of mildew rising like memory. At the back, tucked into the cover, was a dried leaf, pressed flat. Willow, I thought. I asked if she'd placed it there. She shook her head. It was then that something occurred to me, small but insistent. The tea, 2 cups poured, though she had expected only me. A habit or memory? Perhaps she had not yet accepted absence as fact, or perhaps she was still waiting for him. When I stood to leave, she stopped me. She said that if I went to the river that evening, I should look beneath the old footbridge, the one that led toward Christchurch Meadow. There was something there she hadn't had the courage to remove. Her voice trembled only once on the word remove. I promised nothing, thanked her, and stepped outside. The corridor was empty, the air still damp from the night's rain. I thought of the second cup of tea cooling on her table, untouched, and of all the small rituals we performed to keep the dead among us a little longer. By dusk I was walking along the river path again. The water ran high, whispering against the roots of the willows. I paused by the footbridge. Something pale glimmered beneath it, a scrap of paper caught in the reeds. I reached down, careful not to lose my balance, and saw a fragment of handwriting, washed and thinned almost to transparency. Just one line remained: translation is the only way to vanish and remain. The light was fading fast. I folded the paper into my pocket, unsure whether I had retrieved a clue or an elegy. Either way, the river had given it back. It was the post that unsettled me, not the envelope, but its absence. No stamp, no postmark, nothing to indicate where it had come from. I had found it slipped beneath my door in the dim hours of the morning, the paper faintly damp, as if it had been carried through the fog outside. The handwriting was small, precise and deliberate, the kind that belongs to someone used to making their thoughts permanent, yet cautious enough to leave nothing more than necessary. I unfolded it slowly. Just a single line. He saw the transformation before it could begin. No signature, no date, only the weight of implication. I thought immediately of Keane, of Rayner, and of the real in the archive. Transformation, absence. Each phrase is a mirror of the other, each echoing along the walls of my mind. The absence of a stamp seemed to mirror the absence of the boy himself. Not lost, not missing, but deliberately unmarked. I walked to the window, staring down at the quadrangle below. The morning fog clung to the stone like dust. Somewhere a crow landed on a ledge and pecked with methodical patience. The world remained orderly and indifferent, though I knew the order was fragile. Later I visited Mrs. Godfrey in the archive again. She was surprised to see me so early, though she did not comment. I asked if she had noticed anything unusual recently, letters, misplaced items, or signs of someone attempting to communicate through unorthodox means. She shook her head, eyes distant, as though scanning the infinite corridors of her memory. Yet a faint crease at the corner of her mouth suggested she had indeed thought of something she would not share. Back in my room, I placed the letter beside the notebook Keane had left with Rayner. I compared the lines, the spacing, and the pressure of the pen. Slightly different, yet the cadence was familiar. Someone was echoing him, or perhaps repeating him. I could not tell which. By mid-afternoon I had visited the North Gate again, where Rayner had been seen leaving after the dinner invitation. The ground was wet from an early drizzle. Muddy footprints led away from the gate, small and hesitant, like someone uncertain of each step. They ended abruptly at the edge of the river path, as though the walker had stepped into the fog itself. The faintest trace of ink glimmered on a leaf, caught among the reeds, red, blurred, and insistent. I returned to the college carrying the letter and noticed a young porter polishing brass handles with deliberate care. He glanced at the envelope in my hand, offered no comment, only an expression of polite curiosity. I wondered whether he recognized its handwriting or whether the significance was invisible to all but me. The afternoon wore on and I poured a second cup of tea, stirring absent-mindedly. The crossword I had been keeping close lay open before me. The clue that caught my attention was an across disappearance by design. 7 letters. I paused, considering the phrase. It was more than a puzzle. It was a statement of method, and I began to see how the various absences, the bicycle, the notebook, the umbrella, the unposted letters, were connected by intent rather than chance. Evening approached, and the light faded into Oxford's familiar grey melancholy. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my coat pocket. The river outside gurgled quietly, indifferent. Somewhere, Keane's words persisted, surviving in fragments, in gestures, in the subtle traces left behind. The letter without a stamp had arrived, but its message had been there all along, waiting to be noticed by someone who knew how to read absence as carefully as presence. I walked to the window once more, listening to the faint trickle of water and the occasional peck of a crow. The city seemed at peace, though I knew the quiet was a veneer. Somewhere beneath the surface, transformations were still occurring, deliberate and unseen, leaving behind only echoes and questions. The morning arrived with a drizzle that made the stone pavements gleam and the spires of Oxford appear as if carved from wet slate. I found myself in the senior common room, a crossword open before me. It had been left on a chair, freshly printed, and I could not resist the pull of a puzzle. Most crosses were innocuous, academic, but one caught my eye. Transformation denied, 5 letters. I had written stone before, yet now the word seemed insufficient. The clue itself felt less linguistic than moral, less a question than a summons. While I pondered it, the door opened quietly. Raina entered, carrying the blue notebook once belonging to Keane. She did not sit, only inclined her head in recognition. I offered no comment. She placed the notebook on the table, flipping it open to a page that had not been examined before. Here, Keane had crossed out a line. He had written, "Absence is the final translation." The ink was smudged, as though hesitation had become physical. I traced the faint scratches with my fingertip. Someone had wanted to undo the assertion, but could not erase the thought behind it. She spoke, her voice careful, aware of the walls and the air around us. She wondered whether I had noticed the repetition in his cross-outs. I said I had, though I did not mention the letter without a stamp, the scrap of paper beneath the footbridge, or the whispered phrases she herself had let slip in the archive. Observations accumulate like dust. They settle whether one acknowledges them or not. Raina leaned closer to the notebook. She murmured that Keane had been obsessed with precision. Even the smallest gestures mattered. A line crossed, a word underlined, a page left blank. Each action had weight, and yet, she said, he feared its permanence. I wondered if that fear had followed him into absence. I asked about the crossing itself. She paused, then explained that he had deliberately negated the line, thinking it might betray too much to anyone who read it later. Perhaps, she said, he had known that disappearance is often easier than explanation. The subtle hesitation in her tone suggested both admiration and anxiety. We examined the rest of the notebook. References to Ovid appeared alongside Keane's own notes on morality, absence, and translation. One fragment stood out. The meaning of removal is revealed to the observer. I noted the careful repetition of certain words: absence, translation, observer. They had begun to form a pattern, faint but insistent, like a river tracing its course beneath stone. The crossword lay open beside us. I wrote the truth lightly beneath transformation denied, hesitant but deliberate. Perhaps it was not the act itself that mattered, but the recognition of the act. A subtle shift in understanding, an overlooked gesture, could alter perception entirely. The cross-out in the notebook had become a clue in its own right, signaling intention and denial simultaneously. Later, we walked through the cloisters. The rain had lifted, leaving cobblestones slick and reflective. Her umbrella was closed, the handle glinting faintly in the evening light. She spoke of Keane's fascination with the river, how it reflected everything but preserved nothing exactly as it had been. I thought of the paper beneath the footbridge, the blue notebook, and the unposted letter. Each piece of evidence was a reflection, a partial truth, distorted and yet essential. By the time I returned to my rooms, Oxford was hushed, the kind of stillness that magnifies absence. I laid the notebook beside the crossword, the inked cross-outs and erased lines, staring back like faint shadows. The crossed clue, I realized, was not merely about Keane. It was about the observer, about the weight of recognition, about noticing what was deliberately left unfinished. I poured a measure of whiskey and stared at the two objects before me, absence and presence, line and cross-out, puzzle and solution, all intertwined. Somewhere, I thought, the river remembered everything, and perhaps so did we, in fragments, reflections, and subtle gestures that insisted on being noticed. The river that evening had risen again, swollen from unremarkable rain, and the unseen decisions of Oxford's roof lines. I walked along the bank, boots sinking slightly into the softened soil, my coat pulled tight against the chill. The fog clung low, the air heavy with the scent of wet moss and something older, something carried by water and time. I had not expected company, yet when I reached the footbridge, I saw her standing there, Raina, umbrella closed, the damp hair of her temples clinging to her skull. She looked at me without surprise, as though she had known I would follow. The notebook lay at her feet, a silent witness, and a small lantern glowed dimly between us. She spoke first, not the measured tones of the archive or the corridors, but something softer, tremulous, as if the river itself had lent her voice. "I came because I must," she said, "because what has been absent demands to be confronted." We talked then, walking along the path where the reeds brushed our legs. She confessed that she had tried to guide Keane, subtly, intentionally, knowing the boy's mind was restless and brilliant. She had left the umbrella at the river the night he vanished, a quiet signal, a trace to show she had been present, yet had done nothing to stop his disappearance. It was deliberate. The absence, she said, was a translation of intention. I asked her if she regretted it. She paused, fingers tightening briefly on the lantern's handle, then said that regret was a luxury reserved for those who had survived. Her eyes fell on the water, reflecting the faint lantern glow, and I understood she had already mourned in absence, in silence. I examined the notebook again. The last pages contained crossed-out lines, marginal notes, and the faint impression of erased ink. The boy had written, "The observer may reconstruct absence," and then struck it through. She admitted to having seen the line, to having understood its weight. That knowledge, she said, had made her complicit in the act, though she had not touched the boy. I considered the phrase, turning it over as we walked. It mirrored the crossword clue I had puzzled over days ago. Transformation denied. Stone, truth, neither entirely correct. The act had not been physical but intellectual, moral. Absence had been enacted deliberately, observed carefully, preserved meticulously. A faint noise drifted from the riverbank water lapping against submerged roots, perhaps a fish, breaking the surface. She glanced at it, then back at me. She admitted that she had left him the notebook on her desk, half expecting him to understand, half expecting him to vanish anyway. The boy's disappearance was not a crime of malice but of necessity, she said, though necessity itself felt cruel to the living. I noticed the faintest trace of red ink on her wrist, residue from the letters, the notes, the markings she had made in quiet study. A subtle gesture, almost imperceptible, yet telling. It spoke of deliberation, of attention, of the moral calculus she had performed, while the world continued as though nothing had occurred. By then, night had gathered fully over the river. The lanterns cast weak reflections, the mist rising like whispered apologies. She stood silently waiting. I understood that this confession was both a relief and a trap. The boy had vanished, yet, through her admission, the absence had shape, had narrative, had consequence. Before I left, she picked up the notebook, held it for a moment, then handed it to me. A gesture of trust or surrender, I could not tell which. I took it, feeling the weight of absence in my hands, heavier than any physical object. As I walked back toward the college, the river murmured beside me, indifferent yet insistently present. I realized that Oxford had not swallowed the boy, nor had the river carried him away. Absence had been observed, catalogued, and confessed. And in that confession lay a truth more intricate than any footprint, more deliberate than any line of ink that sometimes, to vanish, is to be fully seen. The hall was silent, not the polite, studious silence of morning recitation, but the kind that feels abandoned. The chairs were neatly aligned, the blackboard wiped clean, yet the air retained a memory of presence chalk dust suspended like motes in the weak afternoon light. I paused at the doorway, noting how the shadows pooled beneath the high windows, darkening the corners where secrets prefer to linger. I had come to see if the lecture Dr. Rayner had promised weeks before had actually taken place. The door creaked faintly as I pushed it open. No one was present. Not a single student. No echo of footfalls. Even the faint scent of ink and old paper seemed muted, as though the hall had drawn its breath and held it in reserve. I walked slowly between the rows, observing the minutiae that often escape notice, the scuff marks where a desk leg had dragged, the faint pencil lines etched on the margin of a lecture handout, a forgotten pin tucked beneath a chair leg. Each was a trace of absence, small, subtle, but telling. Near the podium, I noticed a scrap of paper folded in half. It bore only one word, hastily written, observe. I thought immediately of Keene, his notebook, and the crossed-out lines in red ink. The word was a directive, and perhaps a confession in miniature, left behind for someone who might care to see. I ran a finger along the edge of the stage. There was a faint indentation, a mark where a chair had been dragged back hastily, though no one remained to claim it. I imagined a student arriving late, pausing, reconsidering, and then leaving without entering the hall. The gesture, innocuous to most, seemed deliberate in this context. On the podium, a lecture note lay open, the pages damp from some recent moisture, the ink running slightly at the edges. The final line was underlined twice. Translation is fidelity to absence. I recalled Rayner's quiet admissions, the river, the notebook, the letter, without a stamp. Every act of observation, the scribbled line, the underlined sentence, the abandoned seat, formed a chain I could feel more than see. I turned toward the window, noticing the thin light slicing across the room, illuminating the dust in fine shafts. A cobweb in the corner held a single dewdrop like a lens, reflecting a fragment of the high ceiling. In it, I saw the hall as it had been, alive with whispers, footsteps, and the nervous energy of students. The present was empty, yet the past persisted, tangible in the smallest details. Stepping back, I examined the notice board at the rear. A calendar was pinned there, the day circled, lightly in pencil the date of the lecture. Beneath it, a single line of a crossword clue caught my corner of vision. What is missing shapes what remains. 7 letters. I hesitated, then wrote absence in the margin, aware that the hall itself seemed to nod its agreement. I left the hall slowly, pausing at the doorway to glance back. The rows of chairs, the open handout, the faint smell of chalk, all seemed poised in expectation. I realized that the emptiness was not failure or neglect, it was deliberate, a mirror of all that had been removed, of all that had vanished. The lecture was not the lesson the students had missed, but the one that had been quietly given to me, and perhaps only me. Outside, Oxford was bathed in the melancholy glow of late afternoon. The river murmured in the distance, the fog settling gently over the quadrangle. I walked on, carrying the quiet weight of observation, and the reminder that some lessons arrive not with sound, but in absence. The bell at St. Giles rang late that evening, hollow and deliberate, echoing through Oxford's narrow streets as if marking not time, but reflection. I walked beneath it, coat collar turned against the chill, listening to each strike reverberate across stone and memory. It was the kind of sound that summons thought, and perhaps reckoning. I had retraced the river path one last time, noting how the water caught the fading light in gentle shimmer. The footbridge stood empty, but the memory of her confession lingered as tangibly as mist. Rayner's words, Keane's notebook, the crossed-out lines, the scraps of paper, the letter without a stamp formed a constellation I could trace only by feeling the space between them. The quadrangle was nearly deserted, the faint smell of wet grass mingling with the lingering scent of damp books from the library. I paused near the cloister, noticing the subtle unevenness of a paving stone. It was minor, easily overlooked, yet it suggested hurried footsteps, a pause, reconsideration. The observer's footprint, not the vanished boy's, but the one who had arranged absence with meticulous care. I thought of the crossword clue that had haunted the investigation. What is missing shapes what remains. Absence, truth, silence. They were not merely gaps, they were directions, instructions for those willing to see. The final lines in Keane's notebook, crossed and recrossed, carried their own rhythm, a deliberate hesitation that spoke of caution and understanding, of comprehension without interference. Somewhere, a cat moved through the shadows, its coat slick with rain. I watched it pause at the corner of the wall, ears twitching, then vanish into darkness. Even in the city, absence has agency. Later, I found myself on St. Giles, watching the lanterns reflect in the wet cobblestones. The bell continued to toll, each chime a punctuation on the city's quiet narrative. I recalled the line on the footbridge translation is the only way to vanish and remain. The phrase seemed more precise than any physical clue. The disappearance had been executed not through concealment but through observation, deliberate and untraceable except in its subtle effect. I passed the college gates and paused. The quadrangle lights glimmered faintly, the fog softening edges, merging presence and absence into a single, unreadable surface. A brief flash of red on a leaf, damp and collapsed, caught my eye. The ink had run into the fibres, leaving only a suggestion, a whisper of what had been recorded. It mirrored the notebook's final page, the underlined sentence, the crossed-out lineal fragments of a meticulous architecture of disappearance. I lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward, dissipating as swiftly as the day's memory. Oxford slept lightly, its streets slick and silent. I felt the weight of observation, the responsibility of comprehension. The river, the archive, the empty lecture hall they had taught the same lesson. The act of noticing can be as profound as the act itself. By the time the last chime faded into quiet, I knew the case had reached its coda. There would be no more letters, no more scraps to discover, no more confessions beside the river. What remained was the trace, the echo, the deliberate absence, filled with meaning. I walked slowly back to my rooms, listening to the soft drip of rain from gutters and the distant footfall of a solitary student returning late. Somewhere, the river whispered against its banks, a private murmur of continuity. I realized that Oxford itself had become a witness, keeping the memory of all that vanished and leaving behind only the faintest, most insistent clues for those who chose to observe. The bell had stopped, but its lesson-lingered presence is defined as much by what is missing as by what is seen. And in that knowledge I found both clarity and unease, a quiet coda to a river, a notebook, and the brief, deliberate disappearance of Jonathan Keene.